she'll fall for it again. Your sister always wants to be the hero. Let her think she's saving us and she'll hand over everything.
You're the only one who can fix this. This is the house where you grew up.
We have 10 days.
My bank won't authorize a transfer without verified recipient information.
The house is not in danger. It has never been in danger. This account doesn't belong to the county. It belongs to your company. You told her I'd fall for it again. You heard us? I heard everything.
She'll fall for it again. I was standing in the hallway of my childhood home, a bottle of champagne in one hand and a lemon cake in the other, ready to share the best news of my career when I heard my mother say those words through the kitchen door. Her voice was calm, almost bored, like she'd said it 100 times before and already knew how the night would end. I didn't move. I stood in the dark and listened as my mother coached my sister on how to take $164,000 from the account I'd spent 6 years building the money meant for my first home. They talked about how easy it had always been, how I never asked for proof, how all it ever took was tears. I tightened my grip on the bottle and stepped back into the shadows. Because this time, I already knew everything. If you've ever felt like the person your family calls when they need something, not when they want to celebrate you, not when they ask how you're doing, but only when something has gone wrong and someone needs to pay for it, stay with me. This story is for you. And if it resonates, I'd love for you to subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. The night before I overheard my mother planning to rob me, I was sitting across from my best friend Kira at a corner booth in our usual diner, telling her I was finally going to do it, buy the house, sign the papers, stop putting it off. Kira had been listening to me talk about that house for 2 years. She knew the neighborhood, the floor plan, the direction the kitchen window faced in the morning. So when I said I was ready, she didn't cheer the way I expected. She set down her coffee and looked at me with the kind of expression people use when they're about to say something they've been holding back for a long time. "Have you noticed," she said carefully, "that every time something good happens to you, your family suddenly has an emergency?" I told her she was reading too much into it. I told her my family wasn't like that. She didn't argue, she just nodded slowly and changed the subject, the way Kira always did when she knew pushing further wouldn't help. But her words stayed with me on the drive home, and I found myself sitting in my parked car for 10 minutes longer than I needed to, staring at nothing before I finally went inside. I had been working at North Shore Provision Group for nearly 8 years. I started as an order coordinator fresh out of college, logging shipments and answering phones, and over time I worked my way up to running the entire operations department. I was good at my job in the way that people who grow up having to be responsible tend to be good at things quietly, consistently, without much fanfare. My colleagues trusted me with problems they didn't want to escalate. My supervisors gave me the hard accounts. I had learned early that being capable meant being the person everyone else leaned on, and for a long time, I didn't know how to separate that truth from the rest of my life. My family had a version of me that was very similar. In our house growing up, in the 2-story colonial on Elmhurst, where my parents had lived for over 30 years, I was the responsible one, the dependable one, the one who figured things out. My younger sister Brielle was the other kind, the creative one, the dreamer, the one my parents talked about with a particular warmth in their voices, in that I used to think was just the way parents talked about their younger children. It took me a long time to understand it wasn't about birth order at all. Brielle ran a wedding planning company called Ivory Fern Events. She posted photographs of elaborate ceremonies and resort weekends and designer outfits, and our parents shared every post with the kind of pride that filled a room. When a client pulled out of a contract, and Brielle lost 40% of her revenue in a single month, my mother called it bad luck. When Brielle's vendor relationships fell apart because invoices went unpaid, my father said the industry was difficult. And when the money ran short, which it did, more than once my parents called me. They always called me. Over 6 years, I had transferred money to my family totaling $83,400, $9,500 to repair the heating system in my parents' home, $7,800 for my father's knee surgery, which I later learned was almost entirely covered by his insurance, $12,000 to pull Brielle's company out of crisis after a large client cancellation, $4,600 for an aunt I was told was about to lose her house, who apparently never asked for help at all. The rest arrived in smaller amounts, taxes, prescriptions, insurance gaps, things that always came with a sense of urgency and never came with receipts. I never asked for documentation. I told myself that was because I trusted them. But the more honest answer was that I didn't want to be the kind of person who made her family prove they were suffering before she helped them. None of that stopped me from saving. I was careful with money in a way my family never seemed to notice or credit. I packed lunches, declined vacations, kept the same car for 9 years, and watched my savings account grow slowly and steadily toward something I wanted more than almost anything else. By the time I walked into that house on Elmhurst with a bottle of champagne and a lemon cake, I had $212,000 set aside, enough for a down payment. Enough for the house, enough to finally build something that was entirely mine. That evening, I had just been promoted to Director of Supply Chain Management at North Shore. My salary was increasing by nearly 35%. My boss had offered me a choice of 3 regional branches, and I had turned them all down because I wanted to stay in Providence, close to my parents, close to Brielle, close to the version of family I still believed in. I bought the cake because lemon was my mother's favorite. I bought the champagne because I wanted to mark the moment. I drove to Elmhurst the way I always did, without calling ahead, because the front door was never locked, and my family had always told me I didn't need to announce myself. The door was open. I stepped inside and heard Brielle crying in the dining room, and I moved toward the sound the way I always did automatically, ready to help. I was almost at the door when my mother's voice stopped me cold. "Don't panic. She's fallen for it every single time. She'll fall for it again." What I heard in the next 20 minutes reordered everything I thought I knew. Ivory Fern Events hadn't just hit a rough patch, it had collapsed entirely. Brielle had been using deposit money from newer clients to cover costs for older ones, a cycle that held together until too many events were canceled at once, and the whole structure caved in. She owed $164,000 to clients, vendors, and the bank. Several clients had already hired attorneys. If they could demonstrate that she had deliberately misused their deposits, she was looking at a fraud investigation. My parents were not asking Brielle to face any of it. They were helping her figure out how to take the money from me instead. My father had pulled a foreclosure notice template from the internet and was walking my sister through how to edit the county seal, change the property address, and insert a 10-day deadline for $164,000. My mother would tell me that my father had taken out a secret loan against the house to cover her medical bills she would cry about and apologize for hiding, and that the home was now at risk of seizure. My father had worried aloud that I might check public records. My mother laughed and said I wouldn't, because I never had before. All she had to do was cry. "Your sister always wants to be the hero," my mother said. "Let her think she's saving us, and she'll hand over everything." Then they started going through the list. The heating system money had paid for a trip to the Bahamas. My father's knee surgery had been covered almost entirely by insurance. The aunt who was supposedly losing her house had never once asked me for anything. Every emergency I had rushed to meet, every transfer I had made without asking questions, none of it had been what they said it was. I stood on the other side of that door and felt something shift inside me, not dramatically, not with the kind of collapse I might have expected, but quietly, like something that had been slightly off-center for years finally settling into its true position. I turned around and walked back to my car. I sat behind the wheel for a long time. Part of me wanted to go back in and say everything at once, to stand in that dining room and make them account for every lie, every dollar, every year I had spent believing that my family needed me the way they said they did. But I knew exactly how that would go. My mother would cry. My father would say the conversation had been taken out of context. Brielle would find a way to make me feel guilty for listening, and by the end of the night, I would be the one apologizing. So I did something they would never expect from me. I drove around the block twice, waited nearly 20 minutes, then came back and made enough noise pulling into the driveway that they'd have time to compose themselves. I shut the car door hard. I called out from the porch before I even opened the front door. When I walked in, the scene had been reset. Brielle was dry-eyed and quiet. My father had put his laptop away. My mother was pouring tea at the kitchen counter, like it was an ordinary Tuesday evening. I told them about the promotion. I told them about the raise. My mother didn't ask whether I was happy or whether the new role suited me. She asked, with careful precision, exactly how much I had managed to save. I told her I was sitting at just over $200,000 and that the bank had already started the loan approval process. Out of the corner of my eye, I watched my sister's shoulders drop with relief. Before I left, my father mentioned that the family might be facing some financial difficulties soon. I reached over and held his hand and said, "Whatever happens, I'm not going to let this family lose this house." I meant it to sound like a promise. I needed them to believe it was one. The moment I got home, I moved every dollar into a new account at a different bank, revoked access to the joint account my mother had been listed on since I was in college, and changed every password I owned. Then I spent 2 hours on the county assessor's website, confirming what I already suspected: my parents' home carried no outstanding tax balance, no lien, no record of any foreclosure proceeding. The house was fine. It had always been fine. After that, I called a lawyer who specialized in financial fraud and made an appointment for the following week. For the first time in 6 years, I wasn't preparing to rescue my family. I was preparing to protect myself from them. 3 days later, my mother called me at 7 in the morning, her voice pitched at exactly the frequency she had always used when she needed me to stop thinking and start moving. She said a county officer had delivered a foreclosure notice to the house the evening before. She said they had 10 days. She said she didn't know what to do. I told her I was on my way. When I walked into the living room on Elmhurst, the scene was so carefully arranged that for a moment I almost admired it. My mother was sitting on the couch with a family photo album open across her lap, tears running down her face in a way that looked entirely natural because, with her, it always did. My father was pacing near the window, repeating quietly that he had failed his family, that he had never meant for it to come to this. Brielle was standing near the far wall with her arms crossed, staring at the floor, playing the role of the sibling who was too devastated to speak. On the dining table sat a manila folder with a county seal printed at the top and the words, "Final Foreclosure Notice" stamped in red across the front. My father sat me down and told me he had taken out a second mortgage on the house 2 years ago to cover my mother's medical expenses and treatments. She had kept secret because she hadn't wanted her daughters to worry. My mother reached over and took my hand and began to talk about the house itself. She talked about the height marks penciled onto the kitchen door frame, 2 columns of them, mine and Brielle's, going back to when we were 3 and 5 years old. She talked about the Christmas mornings in this room, and the tire swing my father had hung from the oak tree in the backyard when I was 7, and the way the light came through the back windows on summer evenings. She wasn't asking me for money. She was handing me my own childhood and asking me to decide how much it was worth. Brielle looked up from across the room and said, "You're the only one who can fix this, Laurel." I told them I wanted to help, but that my bank wouldn't authorize a transfer of $164,000 without a formal contract and verified recipient information. My father immediately produced a handwritten sheet with an account number and routing information for what he described as a county-approved debt resolution firm. I took the paper, looked at it carefully, and set it down on the table next to the folder. Then I reached into my bag and placed an envelope beside it. Inside was a document I had requested from the city assessor's office 3 days earlier. An official written confirmation that my parents' property carried no outstanding tax balance, no mortgage lien beyond the original home loan, and no record of any foreclosure proceeding, active or pending. The house was not in danger. It had never been in danger. I placed beside that document a second sheet, a printout from the State Business Registry showing the full ownership details of the debt resolution account my father had just handed me. The account did not belong to any county agency. It belonged to Ivory Fern Events, LLC. It belonged to Brielle. The room went completely quiet. My mother's expression shifted in a way I had never seen before, not into guilt, but into something colder, more calculating, as if she were rapidly sorting through her remaining options. I looked at her directly and said, "You told Brielle I'd fall for it again." My mother's face went pale. I told them I had been standing in the hallway 3 nights ago. I had heard the entire conversation, the template my father downloaded, the script my mother had written for herself, the list of every time they had taken money from me, and what it had actually been used for. The Bahamas trip, the knee surgery the insurance had already paid for. The aunt who never asked for anything. My father said it had been a panicked conversation that didn't reflect how they actually felt. My mother said they were trying to protect Brielle from people who didn't understand how difficult her situation was. Brielle said nothing for a moment, and then she stopped being quiet and started being loud. She said that if I walked out of that house without helping her, she would lose everything, clients would sue, her name would be destroyed, Her entire life would be over, and that it would be my fault for refusing to act when I had the means to do so. I took out one final document. It was a table I had put together the night after I drove away from Elmhurst the first time. Every transfer I had made to my family over 6 years, organized by date, amount, and stated purpose, totaling $83,400. I set it on the table and asked them to walk me through each line. No one spoke. My father looked at the floor. My mother pressed her lips together. Brielle turned back toward the wall. "You were right about one thing," I said. "I did fall for it. Every single time. But the trap was never the fake paperwork. The trap was believing that if I sacrificed enough, you would eventually love me the way you love Brielle." I picked up the forged foreclosure notice, put it in my bag, and told them that using a government seal to manufacture a legal document and directing someone to transfer funds based on that document carried serious legal consequences. Then I walked out. For the next several days, my family said nothing. No calls, no messages, no relatives appearing at my door. The silence should have felt like relief, but it didn't. It felt like the moment before weather changes, that particular stillness that isn't peace, it's just pressure building somewhere you can't yet see. I went to work. I continued the paperwork on my home purchase. I kept my appointments, but some part of me was always listening for what came next. I called Kira one evening, not because I needed advice, but because I needed to say it all out loud to someone who already knew the shape of it. She listened without interrupting, and when I finished, she didn't say she had warned me. She just asked, "Are you okay?" I thought about it honestly before I answered. "I don't know," I told her. "But for the first time, I don't feel like I have to be okay right away." Kira didn't try to fill the space after that. She just stayed on the line, and that was exactly enough. What I understood in those quiet days was something I hadn't been able to see clearly before, that the pain I was feeling wasn't a signal that I had done something wrong. It was just pain. It was allowed to exist without meaning I needed to go back and undo my choices to make it stop. The silence ended without warning, the way it always does when someone realizes that patience isn't working and decides to try pressure instead. My mother started calling from numbers I didn't recognize, leaving voicemails that were long and breathless and carefully designed to make me feel responsible for her physical deterioration. She said her blood pressure had been elevated for days. She said she couldn't sleep. She said she hoped I understood what I was doing to her. My father sent text messages in the middle of the night saying that a good daughter wouldn't let her sister face criminal charges alone. Brielle moved through phases, first pleading, then bargaining, then something that wasn't quite a threat but was constructed to feel like one. She said if her life was going to be ruined, she didn't see why I should get to walk away untouched. When I blocked every number they used, they shifted direction entirely. My mother began calling extended family members, cousins, aunts, and uncle I hadn't spoken to in years, and telling them that I was wealthy and refusing to help my parents avoid losing their home. She did not mention the forged documents. She did not mention Brielle's debt or the account number my father had handed me. She told a version of the story in which I was the only villain, and it traveled the way those stories always do. Messages arrived from people I barely knew, telling me that money had changed me, that my parents had sacrificed everything for my education and my future, that family was supposed to mean something. Brielle posted something on social media about being abandoned by someone close to her during the hardest chapter of her life. She didn't use my name, but she used enough details that people who knew us both understood immediately. I kept going to work. I kept signing documents. The house closing was scheduled for 3 days out, and I focused on that the way you focus on a fixed point when everything around you is moving too fast. Then the bank called. A credit card account in my name had been flagged $27,000 in outstanding debt, several months past due, currently in collections. I had never opened that account. When I pulled the full report, the registered address was my parents' house on Elmhurst. The secondary cardholder on the account was Brielle Harcourt. The account had been active for over a year. My sister had not just tried to take money from me through deception. She had been borrowing money in my name without my knowledge, without my permission for longer than any of the foreclosure scheme had existed. The debt was already on my credit record. It had already triggered the flag that put my home purchase on hold. If I did nothing, it would stay there and cost me the house I had been working toward for years. If I reported it, I was filing a criminal complaint against my own sister. 2 days after I found out about the credit card, my mother came to North Shore. I was in a logistics review meeting when my assistant knocked and told me there was a situation at the front desk. I walked out to find my mother standing in the lobby, still in her coat, speaking loudly enough for the two receptionists and a sales associate near the entrance to hear every word. She was crying the real kind, or at least the kind that was indistinguishable from it, and she was telling anyone within range that her daughter was trying to send her younger child to prison over money, that I had everything and was choosing to use it as a weapon, that she hadn't raised me to be this way. Security asked her to leave. She didn't raise her voice at them. She simply turned and walked out, slowly, in a way that made sure everyone in the lobby had time to form an impression before she was gone. My supervisor, Malcolm Sutter, was waiting for me when I came back down the hall. He didn't ask for an explanation, and he didn't treat it as a disciplinary matter. He just looked at me steadily and said, "I don't need to know the details. I just need to know, are you safe?" It was such a simple question. My family had never once asked me that. I told him I was working on it. He nodded, and then he slid a folder across the conference table, the Fort Collins proposal, the one I had turned down months ago because I hadn't wanted to leave Providence. He told me there was no deadline on it, and that he thought it was worth a second look. That night I called my parents for the last time. I gave them the opportunity to tell me the truth about the credit card. My father said nothing. My mother acknowledged that they had known Brielle was using my information, but said it had only been meant as a temporary solution, and that given my income, the debt was something I could reasonably absorb over the next few years. I asked why it had never occurred to anyone that Brielle should be the one to face the consequences of what Brielle had done. My mother's answer was immediate and entirely without hesitation. "Because you've always been the stronger one." I had heard her say versions of that my whole life. I used to think it meant she was proud of me. Standing in my apartment that night, surrounded by boxes I had been slowly packing for a move I had planned for months, I finally understood what it actually meant. In this family, being strong wasn't a compliment. It was a justification. It was the reason they had decided, somewhere along the way, that it was acceptable to hurt me because I could take it and Brielle couldn't. And that distinction had become the architecture of everything. Shortly after I hung up, a message came through from Brielle. "If you call the police, you won't have a family anymore." I sat on the floor next to my packed boxes for a long time. Then I picked up my phone and called the attorney I had first contacted 2 weeks earlier. The next morning, I went to the police department and filed a report for identity theft. I submitted the forged foreclosure documents as a secondary exhibit. The bank removed the fraudulent account from my credit file once the investigation was opened, but the process took long enough that my home purchase could not proceed on its original timeline. The seller accepted another offer. The house I had chosen, the one I had walked through 3 times and already begun to imagine my life inside, was gone. My parents told the family I had destroyed us. Brielle was called in for questioning, and I stood in my apartment smaller than I wanted, in a city that no longer felt like mine, and understood that I had protected everything that actually belonged to me, and lost almost everything I had been reaching toward. That was the cost. I had known, somewhere, that there would be one. Knowing it didn't make it smaller. In the weeks after I filed the report, Providence stopped feeling like a place I lived and started feeling like a place I was waiting to leave. Brielle had found ways around every number I blocked: new contacts, borrowed phones, messages that arrived at odd hours and said variations of the same thing, that I had betrayed her, that I had chosen a legal process over a person, that whatever happened next was something I had chosen for our family. A few of my relatives showed up at my apartment building unannounced, standing in the lobby and asking the front desk to call up to my unit. I didn't go down. I watched the elevator numbers from my window until they left. What I understood by then was that my family did not want resolution. They wanted restoration. They wanted me returned to the position I had always occupied, the one where their decisions had no permanent consequences because I would eventually absorb them. Every call, every message, every relative dispatched to my door was not an attempt at repair, it was an attempt at retrieval. And the longer I held the boundary I had drawn, the more clearly I could see how much of our relationship had always depended on my willingness to erase it. I went back to Malcolm and told him I was ready to talk about Fort Collins. He didn't ask what had changed. He pulled out the same folder he had left on the conference table weeks earlier and walked me through the position director of operations for a new distribution center that North Shore was opening in Colorado. The salary was higher than my current rate, The role came with more autonomy than anything I'd had in Providence, and the company would cover relocation costs entirely. I had turned it down once because I hadn't wanted to put distance between myself and my family. Sitting across from Malcolm now, I recognized that particular reasoning for what it had always been, not loyalty, but fear of the guilt that distance would produce. I signed the offer letter that afternoon. The night before my moving truck was scheduled, my father came to my apartment. He didn't call ahead, which was something he had in common with my mother, the belief that showing up without warning was a form of pressure that worked in their favor, that it was harder to hold a position when the other person was standing directly in front of you. He looked older than I remembered, or maybe I was just seeing him differently now, that I had stopped organizing my perception of him around the role I needed him to play. He sat in the one chair I hadn't yet disassembled and told me he wasn't there to fight. He said he just needed me to withdraw the report before I left. He said Brielle was frightened. He said the family couldn't survive what was coming if I didn't step in one more time. He did not apologize for the forged documents. He did not acknowledge the credit card. He said nothing about the $83,400 or the years I had spent transferring money based on emergencies that turned out to be fabrications. What he offered instead was the same transaction he had always offered, repackaged as a final appeal: protect Brielle, and the family stays intact. Refuse, and whatever breaks is something I will have broken. If you get on that plane, my father said, there's no coming back from this. You understand that? I looked at him for a long moment. He was not wrong that something was ending, but he was describing it as though I were the one ending it, as though the relationship had been healthy and whole right up until the moment I decided to stop letting it consume me. I had spent most of my adult life adjusting my behavior to preserve a version of this family that, I now understood, had never quite existed. The warmth I remembered from childhood, the dinners and the holidays, and the specific feeling of belonging somewhere, none of it had required me to be defrauded to be real. It had just been what family felt like before I became useful. I'm not leaving my family, I told him. I'm leaving a system that only calls me family when it needs something from me. I stood up and opened the door. He left without saying anything else. I closed it behind him and stood in my half-empty apartment and felt something I hadn't expected, not grief exactly, but the particular weight of a decision that is entirely correct and still costs something real. I let it sit there. I didn't try to reason it away or reframe it into something easier to carry. I just let it be what it was. Fort Collins was cold in a way Providence wasn't. A dry and open cold that came off the mountains and made everything feel very still and very clear. I arrived with 2 suitcases, 4 boxes of books, and a savings account that was intact. The company had arranged temporary housing while I got settled, and I spent the first few weeks learning the new distribution center, building relationships with the team, and coming home to an apartment that was very quiet in the evenings. I started seeing a therapist about 6 weeks after I arrived. I had thought about it for years, and always found a reason to put it off: too busy, too expensive, not serious enough to warrant it. What I discovered almost immediately was that I had been carrying a story about myself that I had never fully examined. That my value in any relationship was proportional to what I could solve for the other person. I had learned it so early and so thoroughly that I had simply accepted it as a fact about who I was, the way you accept facts about your height or your handwriting. Therapy gave me a way of asking questions that made the architecture of that belief visible, not by challenging it directly, but by sitting with specific moments and letting them reveal what they actually meant. I learned to tell the difference between helping someone because I genuinely wanted to and helping someone because I was afraid of what they would think of me if I didn't. I learned that those two things could feel identical in the moment and have entirely different costs over time. I learned that guilt is not the same thing as responsibility, and that the people who had always been best at making me feel guilty had never once held themselves to the same standard of accountability they applied to me. The work at North Shore's Fort Collins Center was the most satisfying I had done in years. I rebuilt the intake process, renegotiated 3 vendor contracts, and cut operating costs in the first quarter by more than the center's original projections had anticipated. I built a team that communicated directly and handled problems at the level where they actually occurred instead of escalating everything upward. I joined a book club that met on Thursday evenings near the Old Town Square. I started hiking on weekends, first on shorter trails, and then gradually longer ones as my legs adjusted to the altitude. I began to learn the names of my neighbors and to have the kind of brief, easy conversations at the mailbox that accumulate over months into something that feels like community. None of it was dramatic. All of it was mine. About 4 months after I arrived, I found a house on Juniper Terrace with help from a local real estate agent named Phoebe Carver. It was a pale gray house with a wooden front porch and a backyard that was mostly overgrown and clearly hadn't been tended in at least a season. The kitchen was smaller than I would have chosen. The second bedroom had a window that faced a fence. I stood in the backyard for a long time while Phoebe waited on the porch, and when I tried to find a reason not to want it, I couldn't find one that was actually mine. I wasn't calculating whether it was close enough to family. I wasn't keeping the second bedroom available in case Brielle needed somewhere to stay. I just liked the way the light came through the back windows in the late afternoon, and the way the porch boards felt solid underfoot, and the quiet of the street at the end of a day. I made an offer the following morning. It was accepted by the end of the week. Kira called on a Sunday afternoon, nearly a year after I had left Providence. I was outside pulling weeds along the back fence when my phone rang, and I sat down on the porch steps to take the call. She told me that Ivory Fern Events had formally closed. Brielle had reached a resolution with the prosecutor's office. She accepted responsibility for the unauthorized use of my personal information and agreed to a set of conditions that included financial restitution to affected clients, supervised credit monitoring, and several years of structured repayment. Kira also told me that my parents had sold the house on Elmhurst. The proceeds had gone partly toward Brielle's client restitution and partly toward their own outstanding debts. They were living in a 2-bedroom apartment across town. They were telling people, apparently, that I had dismantled the family. Then she told me that my mother had asked for my address. She said she had changed, that she only wanted to send a letter. Kira had looked into it before calling me, and she had found out that my father was in significant financial difficulty. The letter, if it came, would probably not only be an apology. I thought about it for a moment. Not with anger, and not with the particular ache I might have felt a year earlier, but with a kind of clear-eyed recognition that the pattern was simply still there, intact, waiting to see if I had forgotten what I now knew about it. I told Kira not to share my address. I didn't ask her to pass along any message in return. I just said, "Thank you for telling me," and meant it. Before we got off the call, Kira asked how I was actually doing. I looked out at the backyard. The lavender I had planted along the south fence in early spring was starting to bloom, pale purple rose that smelled like something I didn't have a word for yet, something between calm and forward. "I'm doing well," I told her. "Not better than expected, not recovering from something. Just well, the ordinary, undramatic kind of well that doesn't require a before and after to justify itself." After I hung up, I stayed on the porch for a while. On the table beside me were my house keys, a mug that had gone cold, and a financial folder with only my name on the cover. The afternoon was very quiet. A neighbor's dog barked twice somewhere down the street and then stopped. My family had always believed that the trap worked because I couldn't see it. What they never understood was that even after I saw it, I had kept walking toward it not because I was blind, but because I had wanted so badly for it to be something other than what it was. Leaving hadn't required me to stop loving the people inside it. It had only required me to stop pretending that love alone was enough to make the structure safe. I picked up my mug and went inside. The lavender moved a little in the wind behind me, and the back door closed with the particular solid sound of a house that already felt like home. If any part of this story felt familiar, if you've ever been the one your family counts on a little too conveniently, or if you've ever confused being needed with being loved, I hope Laurel's journey gave you something to hold on to. You don't have to set yourself on fire to keep other people warm. And you don't have to earn your place in a family that was supposed to be yours from the beginning. If this story resonated with you, subscribe so you're here for the next one. There are more stories like this about boundaries, about starting over, and about what it actually looks like to choose yourself without an apology. I'll see you in the next video.